Justice isn't always blind, and this story proves it. Imagine a courtroom where fairness should reign, but bias takes the lead. A black defendant finds himself at the mercy of a judge who seems anything but impartial, interrupting, dismissing evidence, and showing little concern for the truth. It feels like a foregone conclusion, an uphill battle against a system stacked against him. But here's the twist. This very judge, confident in his power and untouchable authority, had no idea his own judgment day was just around the corner. Accusations of corruption were quietly building against him, and soon he would trade his gavel for a seat at the defendant's table. What happens when the roles are reversed? Stay tuned as we uncover the shocking events that led to a fall from grace no one saw coming and question how deep the cracks in our justice system really go. The judge in question, known for his commanding presence in the courtroom, had built a reputation for being tough on crime. But for those who stood before him, especially black defendants, his rulings often felt less like justice and more like punishment. Lawyers whispered about his harsh sentences and the way he dismissed objections without a second thought. For the defendant in this case, it seemed as though the outcome was already decided before the trial even began. Family members sat in the gallery, watching helplessly as every effort to present evidence or challenge the narrative was shut down. What no one knew at the time was that this judge had skeletons of his own, secret dealings, questionable decisions, and alliances that raised eyebrows. Investigators were quietly closing in, gathering evidence that would soon turn the tables. But as the trial continued, the defendant could only wonder who, if anyone, was fighting for him. As the trial dragged on, it became clear to everyone in the room that the scales were far from balanced. Witnesses who might have supported the defendant's case were cut off mid-testimony. Key pieces of evidence were dismissed with a wave of the judge's hand. The defense attorney fought back as hard as they could, but it was like shouting into the wind. The judge's rulings were final, his tone sharp, and his expression revealed no hint of empathy. Outside the courtroom, whispers of corruption were growing louder. A journalist, tipped off by an anonymous source, had started connecting the dots. There were rumors of bribes, backdoor deals, and a pattern of unfair rulings. The judge's spotless reputation was beginning to crack, though he seemed completely unaware. For the defendant, though, none of that mattered in the moment. He sat quietly, hands folded, wondering how much longer he'd be forced to fight a battle that felt impossible to win. The courtroom grew more tense with every passing day. The defendant's family watched in silence, their frustration and fear visible in their tight-lipped expressions. Meanwhile, the judge, sitting high on his bench, seemed untouchable, as if his authority alone could silence any dissent. Every objection was overruled, every argument for fairness dismissed. To the defendant, it felt like the walls were closing in, and any hope for a fair trial was slipping away. But outside the courthouse, the story was shifting. The journalist's investigation had unearthed shocking details. Bank records that didn't add up, testimonies from former associates, and whispers from legal insiders who'd long suspected the judge wasn't as clean as he appeared. The pressure was mounting, and the judge, unaware of the growing storm, carried on with his usual arrogance. Inside the courtroom, tension reached its peak when the defense presented one last critical piece of evidence, something that couldn't be so easily dismissed. For a brief moment, the judge hesitated, his confident facade faltering ever so slightly. It was a crack in his armor, but no one yet knew how deep it ran, or how close everything was to unraveling. The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence as the defense revealed their final piece of evidence, a key witness who had come forward at the last minute. This witness claimed to have first-hand knowledge that could change the entire trajectory of the trial. The judge's usual air of control wavered for just a second, his eyes narrowing as he glanced toward the prosecution. It was clear he hadn't anticipated this. The witness testified with confidence, presenting details that directly contradicted the case against the defendant. The jury leaned in, fully engrossed, while the judge attempted to regain control, interrupting and questioning every word. But something was different now. The cracks in his authority were beginning to show. Outside, the journalist's expose had gone live, sending shockwaves through the community. News outlets buzzed with allegations against the judge, with mounting evidence of corruption and misconduct. Inside the courtroom, whispers began to spread among the spectators, their gazes shifting uneasily between the defendant and the man presiding over his fate. Then, as if timed perfectly, the courthouse doors opened mid-trial, and two investigators walked in, their presence commanding attention. They were there for the judge. The air grew heavy with tension. Everyone wondered, was this the moment the tables would finally turn, or would the system protect one of its own? The courtroom froze as the investigators approached the bench. The judge stiffened, his confidence replaced with a flicker of panic. One of the investigators handed him a document, a formal notice that he was under investigation for corruption. Gasps rippled through the room, and for the first time, the man who had wielded so much power seemed unsure of his next move. But the judge, unwilling to relinquish control, attempted to push forward. "This trial will continue," he said, his voice sharp but shaky. Yet the defense attorney stood up, emboldened by the turn of events. "Your Honor," they said, "how can this trial proceed when the very integrity of this courtroom is in question?" The jury shifted uncomfortably, clearly grappling with the weight of what was unfolding. The investigators didn't leave. Instead, they took seats in the back, silently observing as the trial crawled forward. Just when it seemed like the defendant might have a chance at fairness, the prosecution announced a bombshell. They had new evidence to submit, a desperate attempt to regain control. But then came the final twist. The journalist, sitting quietly in the gallery, stood up and handed the defense a sealed envelope. Inside was proof not only of the judge's corruption, but also of falsified evidence in this very case. The courtroom erupted as the defense presented the shocking discovery, leaving the judge no choice but to declare a mistrial. As the defendant walked out, finally free, the judge was led away in handcuffs. Yet the moment wasn't entirely triumphant. It was a reminder of how close injustice had come to winning and how many others might not have been so lucky. The fight wasn't over, but for one man, the truth had finally prevailed. As the defendant stepped outside the courthouse, the weight of the ordeal finally lifted from his shoulders. His family embraced him tightly, tears of relief streaming down their faces. Though justice had been served in the end, it came at a cost, a harsh reminder of how flawed the system can be. The judge's downfall sent shockwaves through the community. Headlines exposed the extent of his corruption, detailing years of biased rulings and backdoor deals. It left many wondering how many lives had been unfairly impacted by his actions. Advocacy groups began calling for reforms, demanding greater accountability in the judicial system. For the defendant, this wasn't just the end of his case. It was the beginning of a mission to ensure others wouldn't face the same injustice. As he spoke to reporters that day, he said, "This fight wasn't just for me. It's for everyone who deserves fairness and truth."